Okay. So Thomas Hobbes, Leviathan. Hobbes wrote the Leviathan quite late in life. He wrote it largely in reaction to the events of the English Civil War. And many people say that that is an essential part of understanding the conclusions that he draws, or maybe the motivation for drawing those conclusions. Because what's interesting about the Leviathan is that it is very unlike Filmer, for example, in one respect, and that is that it justifies political authority by reference to those governed. That is, it thoroughly rejects the idea of the divine right of kings, or it rejects political naturalism that we've seen in Aristotle as well, that humans are naturally political, or that there is some kind of natural hierarchy of humans. Humans, Hobbes insists, are both free and equal, naturally free and equal. Although what he means by those is not the same as what more recent philosophers, or for example, John Locke means by them. So we'll mention them. We'll talk about his definition in a little bit. But still, humans are, there is such a thing as a state of nature. This is the key concept of social contract theorists, of which Hobbes is an early and sophisticated variant. And a state of nature is the natural state of humans, which is not political. In this natural state, there are no political obligations. There is no political authority. So then the question is, if humans begin in this state, how is it that they can ever legitimately leave it, arrive at a political state, arrive in a system whereby there is political authority? That's the question that all social contract theorists have to answer. And Hobbes answers it in a very sophisticated way that modern commentators have said is a sort of forerunner of game theory. Game theory is a theory that blossomed in the 20th century that analyzes human behavior as a rational response to sort of social situations. If anybody is familiar with game theory, the thing that they've come across is something called the prisoner's dilemma. And there is some suggestion by some commentators that it's because of a prisoner's dilemma in the state of nature that you need a sovereign. You need to set up a political state. But at any rate, Hobbes does believe that you can leave the state of nature legitimately and acquire political obligations. So even though naturally humans are apolitical, there is no natural hierarchy, we are naturally all on the same level, there is a route out of the state of nature towards a political system. Now, because of the way that he describes the state of nature, and the phrase from Hobbes that if, you will know even if you didn't know it was from Hobbes, is nasty, brutish, and short. The full quote is, life in the state of nature is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So your life will not last long if you stay in a state of nature. And because the state of nature is so horrific, according to Hobbes, the political system that humans that have been in the state of nature will be motivated to set up, or at any rate, the political system that will last, that will endure, is the maximally stable one. So it's always good to contrast this with John Locke, a later thinker who we'll be coming to next, who was the most influential on the founders of the USA. In John Locke's view, the state of nature is comparatively benign, certainly in comparison with Thomas Hobbes, and that you have great liberty in the state of nature, and you can acquire property. This is one key feature of Locke's state of nature, whereas in Hobbes, the way Hobbes describes it is basically no kind of civilization is possible in the state of nature. If you try to make a little farm, somebody will steal it. So there's no point in trying to improve the land or trying to improve your situation, because in the state of nature, people will just come and take it or destroy it. Whereas in Locke, comparatively sophisticated things can happen in the state of nature, which is why libertarians like Locke, because Locke seems to suggest that it's, life without government at all is fairly tolerable and perhaps the most free kind of existence. So, only the minimal kind of political system can be justified because it's comparatively good in the state of nature, whereas for Hobbes, state of nature, absolutely horrible. So the political system that will prevent us devolving back into the state of nature is justified. And the political system that Hobbes ends up justifying is a lot like the one that Filmer defends. Filmer, the divine right of kings guy, ends up defending a system very similar to Hobbes, the state of nature guy, the social contract theorist. In particular, Hobbes defends the power of the sovereign is absolute, the sovereign is above the law, and the power of the sovereign cannot be divided or limited. So this whole separation of powers thing in the United States is completely anathema to Hobbes. All powers must be concentrated in the sovereign. Now, he's not an out-and-out monarchist. He does suggest that the sovereign can be a single individual, but it can also be a body. So you can have acting as a sovereign like a parliament or something like that. But it cannot be the case that you have separate institutions like Congress, the presidency, and the Supreme Court with competing powers. That is absolutely a no-go for Hobbes for various reasons, because he says once you have separation of powers, you will have disagreement over where the power of one body ends and the power of another body begins, and it will lead to things like the English Civil War, which is, in the English Civil War, is essentially the Parliament against the king. And it broke out because of a disagreement over the authority each had against the other. So when there's a possibility of an argument about what powers each body has or the extent of the powers, then that's going to be unstable and it's going to lead to collapse, which is why you can never divide or limit. You can never have, for example, a body above the king, even like the Supreme Court. You think the Supreme Court isn't going to raise an army. It sounds like Hobbes's worry there is ridiculous, that you're not going to have the Supreme Court suddenly try to take over the presidency. But if you have a Supreme Court, it still limits the power of the sovereign, and effectively, and this is an argument that Filmer uses too, effectively, the real sovereign is then the Supreme Court. If there's a judge above the king, and also what happens if the monarch or the sovereign and the Supreme Court disagree, who mediates that dispute? there's nobody to appeal to, and when there's nobody to appeal to mediate disputes, that's when you get conflict, which is actually the main problem with the state of nature. The problem in the state of nature is there's nobody to mediate disputes. There's nobody to settle conflict. So if you have divided sovereignty, if you have the powers of the sovereign divided up, you haven't solved the problem that sovereignty is supposed to be instituted to solve. Okay, so that's the interesting thing, that on the one hand, and actually critics of Hobbes's Leviathan were sort of in both camps. You have critics like John Locke coming along later, who says, look, why on earth would people in the state of nature, whose problem is other individuals who are essentially the same power as them, why were they, to solve that, set up some kind of super being that is much more powerful and can do much more damage to them, particularly given the powers that the sovereign has? For example, the sovereign has the power of property, of deciding who gets what. So basically everything belongs to the sovereign, and if anybody gets to own it, own property legitimately, it's at the sufferance of the sovereign. Now, again, as with Filmer, the point of the sovereign is to look after the subjects. So, you know, it shouldn't be the case that they're just enriching themselves and leaving the people to starve. And in fact, if that happens, Hobbes has a solution which leads to the other criticism. But to finish this criticism first, Locke famously said, you know, if in the state of nature you're being faced by polecats and foxes, the solution is not to set up a lion, because that's worse. So that's one kind of criticism that a social contract theorist would have against Hobbes. You know, okay, you believe people are naturally free and equal, then why would you give away all of their power to this absolute sovereign? On the flip side of the coin, famously, some critics at the time Leviathan came out, a critic called Bramall, said it was a rebel's catechism, this is Leviathan, because despite the sovereign having absolute power undivided and their judge, and they cannot injure the subjects. So for example, if you say, I'm being oppressed by my monarch, Hobbes says, no, that can't happen, because effectively the monarch is you. The monarch is just using power that you have given them. They have no power that hasn't come from you, and you have, in a sense, agreed to give them this power, so you can't really object. It's as if you were punching yourself and saying, ow, stop punching me. You've got no one to complain to but yourself. And he says the same thing is true of the sovereign. If you object to anything the sovereign is doing, it's like objecting to something you're doing, because they're just empowering themselves. Now, that, of course, sounds very suspicious, and someone like Locke would absolutely reject that reasoning, but that is certainly what he says. You cannot say that the sovereign has broken a contract with you, because this is a very important point that all of the sophisticated social contract theorists say. The social contract that they talk about is not between the people and the sovereign. It is amongst the people. So the social contract is an agreement that all of the people make amongst themselves. And the agreement is to give up power that they have in the state of nature. And so they're agreeing with each other, I'll give up my power if you give up your power. Okay, everybody agreed. And then they invest it. Then they give it to the sovereign. So they haven't sort of given it under conditions to the sovereign. It isn't like, okay, sovereign, I will give you this so long as you obey these terms and conditions. No, the agreement is with each other, that each other will give up their power and the sovereign gets the power, but under no basic conditions. Basically under the conditions that the people in the state of nature, had the power in the first place. And according to Hobbes, as we will see, you have basically unlimited, each person has unlimited freedom to do what they think right to preserve themselves. And so the sovereign gets basically unlimited freedom and under no conditions. So you can never say, oh, you, as happened in the English Civil War, oh, wait a minute, you violated the terms of the powers, so therefore, you know, you're an illegitimate monarch. That can't happen, according to Hobbes. So it sounds very, you know, tyrannical. Sounds like here is an absolute monarch. But on the flip side of the coin, as Bramwell says, a rebel's catechism, in chapter 21, the rights of the sovereign are listed in chapter 18. In chapter 21, he talks about the liberty of the subjects. Now, in the first part of this chapter, he defends something that in in the philosophy of free will is called compatibilism. Yeah, so a little sidebar here. If you start reading the Leviathan, which is a big, heavy book, at the beginning, you will wonder when it's going to get to the political stuff, because it begins like, I don't know, the kind of stuff you read in Descartes. In fact, Hobbes was Hobbes was a contemporary of Descartes, although, in fact, older than Descartes, but Descartes published all his stuff when he was a young man, whereas Hobbes's most famous works are late in life. And Hobbes lived a good, long life, which was pretty remarkable, given that he was always fleeing from Britain because when the power changed hands, he was out of favor, and this kept flip-flopping in the later years of his life. So he had to hop over to France on a regular basis. But lived a good old long life and published most of his important works quite late in life. But Hobbes is one of the people who commentates on Descartes' meditations. Now, in Descartes' meditations, of course, Descartes defends Cartesian dualism, this idea that there are two kinds of stuff in the universe. There is matter that follows all the laws of matter and is determined by the laws of nature, such as the ones that Newton discovered. And on the other hand, there is this other substance, which is mind. And we are a combination of both somehow. We have bodies that are physical, but we also have minds that are immaterial and have no location and all that kind of stuff. Hobbes was a hardcore materialist. That is, whereas Descartes is a dualist, he says there's mind and matter, Hobbes says no, there's just matter. Mind, if you talk about mind, that's just a kind of side effect of matter. So you read the early chapters of Leviathan, and he talks about human beings in a very mechanistic way. He uses an analogy of automata, you know, robots. We are, everything is explained by little springs and motions beginning inside us. So where other philosophers would talk loftily about us having free will and this being a sort of power, we have a complete freedom because we have this immaterial mind part of ourselves. Hobbes believes, no, the entire universe is like a giant machine and we're just part of it. So, in what sense are we free? What is freedom? Well, it's basically just us doing what we want in a certain way, and where our desires are not necessarily under our control. So he is an early compatibilist in the philosophy of free will. Yeah, so why does he begin his great work of political philosophy with all this metaphysics, all this stuff talking about materialism? Well, because you've got to understand what people are. Leviathan is broken into 4 books. The only 2 that most people talk about, unless it's in an actual Hobbes class, are the first two. But the structure that Hobbes had in mind is the first one of man is what he calls, the structure of Leviathan is what he calls resolutive compositive. Okay, what does that mean? Well, when you resolve something, it means take it to pieces. So he says the first chapter is one of the resolutive chapters. That's where if you think of Leviathan as written in response to a political crisis, the English Civil War, he says, how do we fix this? We can't have this happen again. Well, the first thing you've got to do is take everything apart and look at the bits before you can work out what went wrong. So the first book is him taking apart a political system and looking at the matter of the political system, which is humans. So humans are the things that make up a commonwealth. So we got to look at the bits in detail. And that's what the first book of man is about. And it's about man in his natural state, the state of nature, what are humans like, what is the source of the problem. And the key source of the problem is that humans are egoistic. Humans are driven by their desires to further their own interests. That's part of the problem. Now, does that make humans bad? No. Humans are not, Hobbes doesn't think that humans are naturally good or naturally evil. Humans are just naturally the way they are. And if you're going to make a political system that works, you have to understand that nature. Don't judge it, just understand it. So the resolutive part is of man. And then the compositive part of the first two books is the second book, which is on commonwealth, the commonwealth. So this is, given the bits that we've now analyzed, humans, how do we fit them together in a way that won't collapse as we've seen in the English Civil War? And that's where he talks about, the way that a stable, well-constructed commonwealth will be like. The other two books also do that, but the reason why they're less read is because they're mostly about scripture. They're mostly directed at Hobbes's Christian readers of the time. And it's sort of compositive, resolutive in reverse order. So chapter 3 is another compositive one, which is basically a defense of the political, of the argument of the second book with scripture, arguing that this is what a good Christian commonwealth will be like. And then the fourth book is why we haven't got that. It's his explanation of how scripture gets misinterpreted and offering his own interpretation of scripture, which is Hobbes at the time was widely accused of being an atheist because his interpretation of scripture was, first of all, materialist. So what is God? God is made of matter. God is a big material thing. That's a weird view. I mean, that's kind of a view like Spinoza, and Hobbes actually was exposed to Spinoza's work and was basically said, well, he's lucky he can get away with saying that. But, basically God is kind of like the universe and completely incomprehensible to human minds. Now, modern readers of Hobbes don't think he's an atheist. They think he's just kind of a weird but sincere Christian. But certainly at the time he was accused of atheism, and there are people to this day who think he's really an atheist. But there's these two giant sections of the Leviathan that's arguing about religion. Now, some commentators on Hobbes say this is very important because one of the reasons for the English Civil War is that if humans believe that they have a duty to God that is more important than their duty to their political leaders, then of course they should follow God, because God is the more important one. And once you have a significant number of people thinking like that, that's going to lead to terrible instability. Hobbes' solution essentially is to argue extensively that your duty to God is to follow the sovereign, and the sovereign is the representative of God on earth. Again, sounds a lot like divine right of kings, although of course he comes at it from a completely different angle. But that's the way to solve instability, is to remove this this alternative power that like the Pope. People don't remember, but one of the things, John F. Kennedy was the first, and I think Biden is the only other one, Catholic president of the United States. And when Kennedy became president, he basically had to give a speech saying, I won't follow what the Pope says. Because the worry about Catholics was always, well, they've got another leader, the Pope, and they're going to follow the Pope before us, because the Pope represents God on earth. So, you know, this worry that if people believe in religious authorities, it's going to undermine political stability persists to this day, and is, of course, you know, a lot of people talk that way, that they're going to appeal to heaven, you know, if they don't like what the political government will do. And actually, one more. If you look at the frontispiece of Leviathan, is one of the most famous philosophical pictures, and it's actually one that Hobbes designed himself and had commissioned. The most famous part of it is the one that I've got as the banner in our class, is the picture of the king made up of tiny little people. So it's like a giant being composed entirely of tiny little people. That's essentially the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth becomes an entity that can act like a person, or at least a sovereign can, and a Commonwealth exists where you have a sovereign. And so basically the sovereign is composed of all of the people. So the power of the sovereign is from all of the people that make it up. That's why his view is different from Filmer. Filmer says the sovereign just has the power that people never had. The sovereign just naturally has it. Whereas for Hobbes, any power that the sovereign has comes from the power of the individual. So that's the famous representation of that. But equally important for Hobbes was either side of this are two little panels that represent sort of political power or secular power. So, for example, a cannon represents the power of the armies, and the one on the other side represents religious power. So instead of a cannon, you've got lightning bolts. So these are, and actually the sovereign is holding in one hand a representative of a sword that represents terrestrial power, and is it a mitre or scepter? Anyway, you know, a thing that bishops hold, he's holding in the other hand to represent his religious power. So for Hobbes, the second two parts that are all about Scripture are very important, but less so now, because he hasn't got such a Christianity isn't assumed to be the true religion for all humans, as it was in Hobbes's day. So that's why the second two sections, books 3 and 4, are less read. And we're focusing on arguments from 1 and 2. So here's a good summary of what humans are like, at least in the state of nature. And I'm quoting from a piece from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy written by my dissertation advisor, Sharon Lloyd, and Suzanne Schroeder. He said, he assumes that people are sufficiently similar in their mental and physical attributes that no one is invulnerable nor can expect to be able to dominate the others. This is the sense of equality that Hobbes uses. So where this separates him from someone like Locke is the basic idea of all social contract theorists, well, at least up until Kant, all social contract theorists say that there's essentially a state of nature. That is, that there is an apolitical state that is natural to humans. So in some sense, political obligation is artificial, and it is only comes about through the action of humans. Contrast that with political nationalists who say, no, it's natural, we are like bees, or we're born into a natural hierarchy. Social contract theorists reject that. So they have to say that in some sense we're free from political obligation and we are initially equal. Now, what do these free and equal mean? Well, that depends on your social contract theorist. Freedom, for someone like Kant, means a very special thing. It means you are free to use your reason in the way in which it was intended. So, for example, Kant would say you are not free if you just follow your desires. That is the opposite of freedom. Whereas, for Hobbes, that is what freedom is, at least in the state of nature. Freedom is basically absence of restrictions, which is what most people would mean by it today. You are, like, oh no, the rabbit's got free, means it's got out of its cage. So we are free in the state of nature in the sense that there are no restrictions on us, because there are no laws, because there's no political system. Now, this isn't necessarily a good thing, as Hobbes points out, but it's certainly something that most people want. And actually, in the beginning of this chapter 21 on the liberty of subjects, he says, those people who complain of an absence of freedom in society are kind of missing the point, because the freedom that they had in the state of nature led to, because everybody's free. And there's a famous quote by Isaiah Berlin, a 20th century writer on liberty, who said, freedom for the pike is death for the minnow. A pike, of course, is a large carnivorous fish, and a minnow is a small fish. So you get the point. That is, if other people are free, that could be bad for you, because they're free to do what they want to you. So he basically chastises people who complain, about the power of the sovereign, meaning that they're not free. First of all, he says that Greek writers like Aristotle are wrong to say that we're freer in a democracy than we are under a sovereignty. Actually, Aristotle probably wouldn't say that, but certainly there's a tradition in Greek writing, and certainly other Athenians regarded the Athenian system of democracy as the only free one. And Hobbes says, well, that's ridiculous. Probably under the monarch, you would be left alone more than, and actually, again, a point that Filmer makes, under a monarchy, you could be left alone to your own devices just as much under a democracy, and possibly more so. So, under my definition of liberty, you're free. And in fact, he says that the extent of your freedom is determined by the number of the laws. Fewer laws, more freedom. But under someone like Kant, freedom is, you're not free if you follow your desires, whereas for Hobbes, that's exactly what freedom is. And also equality. What is equality? Well, equality might be that you equally have a set of rights. Now, rights are a very controversial notion in moral and political philosophy. There are a lot of writers who are suspicious of them. They say, well, these are weird metaphysical entities. How do you know we have rights? Where does it say on our bodies that we have rights? Are they encoded into our DNA? What's that? It sounds, in fact, the idea of rights sounds like something constructed and made up by humans. So the equality that, although Hobbes does say we have at least one right, that I'll get to in a second, the right of nature, it's not the kind of right that people have in mind, like the Bill of Rights, like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Someone like Locke does say that. He does believe that naturally we have a set of rights. In fact, as I said, the founders were very much influenced by Locke, that we have these sort of God-given rights. Hobbes doesn't say that. So the equality that he talks about is not equal in the sense of having the same basic set of rights. The equality is very down to earth and materialistic. It is, we're basically an equal threat. You know, even if you're bigger than me, I can kill you while you're asleep. So essentially, we're basically an equal threat to each other. That's the equality that he talks about. All right, so sufficiently similar in their mental and physical attributes that no one is invulnerable or can expect to be able to dominate the others. If, for example, you know, some of us were like born 10 feet tall with bulletproof skin, then obviously we wouldn't be equal in that sense. But he says humankind's basically the same. You know, we vary in height only by 25% of our height usually. So we're essentially equal threats. Hobbes assumes that people generally shun death, like they fear death. And actually, this is one area where religion complicates matters, because the only people who don't shun death, who don't fear death, and are therefore understandable in the same ways and responsive to the same kind of offers from other people, are religious people. Crazy religious people who believe that they're going to have a life after death. They're the ones that you want to watch for, because they believe that it doesn't matter if they die. But generally people shun death, and that the desire to preserve their own lives is very strong in most people. While people have local affections, their benevolence is limited. That is, they're very fond of their children, but they don't care about other people's children. And they have a tendency to partiality. My children are much better than your children. Concerned that others should agree with their own high opinions of themselves, people are sensitive to slights. Yes, Hobbes is big on people caring about being dissed. This is a huge source of conflict. Yes, there are three causes of quarrel in the state of nature: competition for resources, distrust of other people, and glory. And glory is connected with this idea of honor, that you know, you're dissing me, so I have to kill you, because unless you respect me, I have to put you in your place. And of course, that's a cause of all kinds of fights. Bar fights break out for this reason to this day. But that's a problem, a natural feature of humans. People are very sensitive to what other people think of them. They make evaluative judgments, but often are seemingly use seemingly impersonal terms like good and bad to stand for their own personal preferences. I'll get back to that in a second. They are curious about the causes of events and anxious about those futures. Those latter two lead to religion, because they are curious about, you know, what causes thunder and anxious about their future. Humans are very likely to invent stories, and those lead to religion. You can see why Hobbes writing this was not popular amongst religious people. So that's the way that people are. Now, the stuff about good and bad. Again, a difference between Hobbes and later social contract theorists like Locke is that Locke believes that there are moral laws that are natural. In some sense, they're the laws of God. That there are laws that apply even in a state of nature. So even if you don't have a political system, for someone like Locke, you have morality. and there are strict moral rules. So you can do something deeply immoral in the state of nature for Locke. This, whether or not Hobbes thinks that, is a matter of some dispute. So are there moral laws in Hobbes' state of nature? Well, on the one hand, he says things in chapters 13 and 14 that appear to be a clear no answer. I quote, "The notions of right and wrong, justice and injustice here have no place," or have no place, have in the state of nature no place. So the very idea of right and wrong doesn't really apply in the state of nature. Now, why would he say that? Well, because essentially it's a war of all against all. It's every man for himself in the state of nature. So it's like moral laws are A, luxury, and B, only exist in a stable situation that you only have when you have a sovereign. And there's a point that many people who argue for divine right of kings say, you can't really have laws of any kind, including moral laws, without a lawgiver. And of course, with Locke, he would say, yeah, that's true, and the lawgiver is God, so you have moral laws in the state of nature. But for Hobbes, he's interested in, well, who's enforcing these moral laws? Nobody's going to enforce these moral laws. In the state of nature, if I kill my neighbor because I can, nobody's going to stop me and nobody's going to punish me. So essentially, you can talk about right and wrong all you want, but do they actually have any effect or any, reality? No. And the quote in chapter 14 is, "Every man has a right to everything and even to another body." Now that sounds like people have a right, but when everybody has equal right to everything, essentially that means nobody has a right. Rights are supposed to, everybody's rights are supposed to protect everybody. So you can't have a right to something that ensures that is greater than the right that somebody else has. Well, in effect, Hobbes is saying everybody has a right to everything, so that means nobody has rights. Well, but on the other hand, so this seems to suggest that he doesn't believe that there is morality, that morality has an existence in the state of nature. And in fact, some writers, there's a guy called Gautier, who wrote a book called Morals by Agreement, who thinks that Hobbes has provided the basis for a justification of morality in game theoretical terms. That is, morality is the solution to game theory puzzles. So this is an idea that essentially egoism is true, that we are just out for our own interests, but that from that one truth, you can come up with a set of moral rules that are ultimately justified by being the solution to the problems of people following their own interests and it leading to conflict. So some people have taken a Hobbesian idea, what they take to be a Hobbesian idea, and say you can construct morality out of self-interest. That morality is simply solutions to problems of conflict that arise from self-interest. That morality is nothing more than that. If you break a moral law, it's not like you'll be punished by God or anything like that. It's just you're acting irrationally in some sense. And that does seem to be one clear way to interpret Hobbes. But on the other hand, he does talk about a right of nature. Gautier would not talk about rights. So what is Hobbes's right of nature? Self-preservation. He says, essentially, you have the right to do anything to preserve yourself. He just thinks that that's obvious, that that human beings as animals out for themselves have this right. So this is, in a sense, a sort of normative claim. So it's not a descriptive claim. The descriptive claims are that we're egoistic, that we're like little automata, that we're driven by desires, including famously a perpetual and restless desire for power after power that ceases only in death. He does say this, but it doesn't mean what it seems like it means. Some people take this quote and say, oh, well, this is the problem. Everybody's trying to expand all the time. Everybody's trying to get power over anybody else. That's not what he means by power. Early on in a section that is not in the excerpt that you've got, he defines power, and there's a whole chapter on it, which is essentially your power is just what you have control over, and you want to have control. You're chasing power after power just so because power is your means of satisfying your desires. So because you have desires, you're going to want the means to satisfy your desires, so you're perpetually seeking the means to satisfy your powers. Now that does mean that we're going to come into conflict, but it doesn't mean that we're seeking political power. Now, on the other hand, though, there are people in the state of nature, not everybody, as this suggests, but there are certainly people who are driven by the desire to control others. You've probably met them. They go into administration. There are people like this in the state of nature who want to control people. That is the thing that gives them their jollies. They want to dominate. And they're another source of huge disagreement. Then, of course, we have the laws of nature. The laws of nature, what are they? So first of all, he says there are no notions of right and wrong. And then he says, but then he has 2 entire chapters given to listing the laws of nature, which obviously must mean laws that apply in the state of nature. So what the hell are these? Well, the way that they are interpreted, or at least one clear way that they're meant to be interpreted, is as Gautier interprets them, as sort of conclusions that you will reach if you are self-interested. And in fact, what he calls the fundamental law of nature is to seek peace. Now, why is that a fundamental law of nature? Because it makes rational sense. If you're in this situation, the state of nature, where everybody is like this, including you, it's going to be hell. And you're not going to be able to live a good life. You're just going to be in perpetual fear of, it's like, I don't know, in Haiti where the gangs are in control. Nobody's enjoying their life there. Everybody's insecure. Everybody needs locks on their doors. You could be killed at any second. There's no police to come and help you. It's horrible. So then, given that fact, it's in your interest to try and escape, to try and make things better, to try and seek peace. So it makes sense. It's not like a law it's not like something written on a stone tablet. That's not what the laws of nature are. They're not God's rules that we couldn't have worked out for ourselves. They're obvious conclusions that you will draw given the facts about humans. So they're sort of the correct conclusions to draw. The laws of nature are the laws that any sensible, rational person will come up with, rules of thumb that any sensible, rational person will come up with once they know what people are like. So they're sort of rules of rationality. Now, of course, he does say that God backs them up. So you could view Hobbes as a divine command theorist as well, but that seems a little tacked on. And it seems like, him justifying himself to the Christians. So it looks like for Hobbes, you can't really even talk about morality outside of a society, outside of a political system, because it's just empty words. Now, that creates a bit of a puzzle, because if there aren't even rules like because how is it that we can even get off the ground in establishing a political society? There has to be some basis of trust. So how is it, I mean, someone like Locke would say, even in the state of nature, there's a moral rule that you have to keep your promises. If you make an agreement, you have to keep it. Whereas Hobbes seems to deny that. So how is it that we're going to establish a social contract? How is it that everybody's going to agree with themselves to give up their right of nature to seek preservation, give that power to the sovereign, so the sovereign is now the sole enforcement body, and that stops everybody fighting? How are we going to ever do that? Well, Hobbes sort of shortcuts it, and he says, and here's another key difference between Hobbes and Locke. According to someone like Locke, whether or not a political system is legitimate depends on whether or not it was set up in the right way. Think of it as like a club. You're only a member of the club if you've agreed to be a member. If you haven't agreed, then you're not a member. So whether or not you're a member depends on a historical fact, whether or not in the past you signed an agreement or you agreed. Whereas Hobbes actually says there are two ways to set up a sovereign. There's sovereignty by institution, which is if everybody sort of has a big parlay in the state of nature and says, this is crap, right? We hate this fighting business. Let's do something about it. Everybody agreed? Okay, well, I'll give up my right to kill you if you give up your right to kill me, and we'll set up a sovereign. That would be sovereignty by institution. But just as good is sovereignty by acquisition, which is if a sovereign, an already established sovereign, comes in and takes over. And then you have a sovereign just as much as if you had a sovereign by institution, which of course Locke would deny absolutely. He said, no, I don't have to obey somebody who came in and just said they're my boss because, I haven't promised them. I haven't made any promise. But political obligation for Hobbes is results-based. The point of the sovereign, why would you ever give up your power to a sovereign? For the purpose of self-preservation, because that's what you care about. So so long as the sovereign can preserve you, can elevate your status above the state of nature, then they have the rights of the sovereign. But the moment they lose the ability to protect you, all bets are off. You don't owe them anything. So in the chapter that led to Bishop Bramwell calling it the Rebels' Catechism, Hobbes lays out when the subject doesn't have to obey the sovereign. And for example, although this will get you confused, on the one hand, the sovereign has the right of life and death over you. The sovereign has every right to sentence you to death. But you also have the liberty to refuse that and to escape. You have the right to resist being killed. You don't have to consent to it. You don't have to say, okay, if my king commands it, here, chop my head off. Absolutely not. You can run, you can do whatever it takes, because the point of the Commonwealth is that it's better than the state of nature. And even in the state of nature, you have the right of self-preservation. So you would never go into a Commonwealth where you're worse off than in the state of nature. So you have the freedom to refuse without injustice, to kill or harm yourself, even if commanded by the sovereign, to confess to a crime, to be conscripted into an army. Now, if you consent to be in an army, then you have to do it. And that's one of the another weird thing about Hobbes. Wait a minute. So justice and injustice have no place in the state of nature. And yet one of the laws of nature is, and this isn't in the excerpt that you've got, I didn't make the excerpt, it's an important part, is one of the laws of nature is you've got to keep your covenants. Covenants are a special kind of agreement. Why have you got to keep your covenants? Why wouldn't you, in a state of nature, promise to do something? A covenant is where somebody gives you something and then later on you give them something else. So it's not simultaneous. It's one thing happens and then the other. So suppose you say, I will promise to pay you if you do this work for me. That's a covenant. So they do the work for you. Why wouldn't you just say, ha, sucks to be you. I've got what I want and now screw you. Why would you then pay them? And according to Hobbes, you absolutely do have to keep your covenants because it's in your self-preservation. And basically it's a Hobbes scholar called Greg Kavka, who's one of the people who took his ideas and applied them to things like nuclear deterrence, game theory and nuclear deterrence, had a really good quip. He said, Hobbes believes that time wounds all heels. Heels, H-E-E-L-S, like bad guys. So time wounds all heels. That is, if you can get away with breaking your covenant, maybe the first time, but you will fast get a reputation and nobody will believe you, and that will work against your self-preservation. You have to be moral for your own good, essentially. So covenants, even in the state of nature, you do have to follow your covenants. So that's why we can have commonwealth by institution. All right, so big picture. Humans in the state of nature, neither good nor bad, they're just what they are. They're self-interested, they have the right to self-interest. This, despite them, they're not evil, but these facts about them will lead to quarrel. They'll lead to so the state of nature is a state of war. Now, a state of war doesn't mean constantly fighting. It means constantly, it's like the Cold War. The Cold War, even if we weren't actually fighting the Soviets, there was a constant threat. So that's what the state of nature is like. So, constant state of anxiety, that's sort of the state of war, caused by the way humans are naturally, drives humans to establish a system, because the problem of the state of nature, that's the other thing, sidebar, a common criticism that we already see in Filmer of any social contract theorist is that the state of nature is a myth. Like, we have no record of humans sort of existing in a pre-political state, obviously. And Hobbes kind of has an explanation for that, because he says you're not going to get literature or any kind of civilization from people in a state of nature because they haven't got the time, they're always guarding against their neighbors. He has a long discussion of how we'll never get technology, we'll never get any kind of advance in a state of nature because humans are just taken up with surviving. But, so consequently, there's no historical record of humans ever existing in this state. So some critics like Filmer would say it's just a myth. There is no state of nature. Humans have always existed in society because we're political animals. Now, Hobbes has a response to that. He says, I'm not necessarily talking about like a like a time in human prehistory. We're going to later on read a famous work by Rousseau called Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, where he describes a kind of human anthropology and talks about the evolution of human society and talks about pre-political society. Hobbes isn't necessarily talking about that. He says, look, you say the state of nature is a myth because it never existed. It still exists because the state of nature is just a situation where there is no common power to fear. What you set up in leaving the state of nature is establishing a common power by giving up your power to the sovereign. Any situation where there is no judge above you, and that's what would happen between the Supreme Court and the sovereign if power was divided or limited, that would be essentially a state of nature again. So that's why we want to avoid that, because we want to get out of the state of nature. And he gives the example, look, think of a sovereign of one country. What relation are they to a sovereign of another country? They're in the state of nature, which is why countries go to war, because countries start acting like individuals in the state of nature. They want to encroach. They say, oh, for our own preservation, for the preservation of our country, we've got to have a buffer zone. So like Russia and Ukraine, Russia will move in once they lose their puppet guy in Ukraine. They start feeling insecure, and so they move into predominantly Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine. That's exactly like the behavior of individuals in a state of nature. So he says sovereigns now are in a state of nature with respect to other sovereigns. So you can't use that it never existed criticism, because it still exists, because this is how I define state of nature. But then that's kind of a trick, because you say, well, wait a minute, if that's all the state of nature is, then why is that human's natural state? I mean, if you're going to use the idea of this is human nature, then you're sort of implying that humans are naturally individualistic and naturally separate from the herd. And does that really make sense? Can we even exist? And another thing, Hobbes does talk about the family and does talk about the power that parents have over their children in a way that Filmer might say, oh, well, you've given me a little wedge for patriarchalism, because it's not as if every human is an individual. You have little clusters, you have groups, you have families. And what if the families got bigger? Wouldn't they be their own little natural political systems? So that's a sort of conflict in Hobbes. But anyway, that's what he says about the state of nature, that it is just a state in which there are no commonly accepted authorities. And that's why the solution is to set up a common authority by setting up a sovereign. And a sovereign, the powers of the sovereign come from the powers of the individuals, which is why if it's no longer in their interest to be ruled by the sovereign, they can take back their power and essentially say, if you're not protecting me, the quote at the end of this chapter is, the end of obedience is protection. That is, the point of obedience is protection. If you're no longer protecting me, I'm not going to be obedient. And as Bramall pointed out, well, this kind of ruins your whole argument, because you said that we've got to have the maximally stable society because the state of nature is so shitty, but you've given us this kind of excuse to disband the Commonwealth at the drop of a hat. Because who gets to judge whether or not the sovereign is legitimately protecting you to the extent that you want? You do. Nobody else can judge that. So basically, Hobbes has given each individual the license to say, I'm not feeling protected enough, so I no longer obey. Now, what Hobbes can do to fight that is a lot of propaganda, because one of the things that the sovereign has a right to is basically control education and decide when control of education and censorship, decide when a book or a particular person is spreading ideas that will lead to to dissolving the power of the sovereign. And of course, somewhat ironically, Leviathan itself was banned for exactly this reason, that reading it might give the populace ideas. But of course, there's also the other two chapters, two books of Leviathan on religion, where he argues that actually a good Christian has to obey the sovereign because God wants them to. And that will be another way to ensure that the sovereignty, that nobody deserts, that nobody free rides and says, I'm not going to do my part. I'll drive on the roads that our Commonwealth has produced. I'll take advantage of all the fruits of a Commonwealth that will not exist in a state of nature of technology, arts, culture, that kind of thing. I'll take advantage of that, but I just won't do my part if ever called on. That's a free rider, and that's someone who's breaking their covenant, and God will punish them according to the arguments of the other two books. But there you go. So it's very interesting in that absolutely disagrees with someone like Filmer on human's natural state, on the origin of power, where power comes from, but ends up arguing for something very similar to what Filmer is arguing, for an absolute sovereign. Now, it doesn't have to be a single individual, but from all of the arguments that Hobbes gives, that would probably be more stable than a body, because in a body you will perhaps have disagreement amongst the members of the sovereign body. But there you go. So there are a lot of tensions in Hobbes. Tensions, for example, are there moral laws in the state of nature? On the one hand, no, but on the other hand, what are these laws of nature? Tensions between what critics like Locke will regard as tyranny, giving the sovereign too much power, that nobody would agree to that. But on the other hand, what critics like Bramwell would say is leaving too much power in the subjects to the extent that it will lead to the dissolution of the Commonwealth. Thomas Hobbes.